Hey, Dr. Affolter here. Welcome back. Now we're going to go through the science part of this. And this really came about when my son loaned me his book, In Search of Schrodinger's Cat by John Gribben. And Dr. Gribben's explaining quantum mechanics to those of us who don't know anything. And at some point he put, the question that physicists have been ducking since the time of Newton is this: is the universe determined? Now, by determined, it means everything could be predicted. And when I saw that, I realized that if I applied physics to biology, we had this idea that if we could falsify it, we could prove the existence of a creator. So I'm going to go through that right now. We're going to start with the Big Bang. Let's get started. I got some slides to show you. Well, I guess we're starting with Newton's laws of motion. So let's start here. Newton has 3 laws of motion, and they are inertia, which is the first law. So what I've got here is a ball on the left moving to the right. A force is being exerted on it from the bottom there, and it changes its direction. So the law of inertia is that a body will remain at rest or remain in motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an outside force. So this is showing that outside force changing the direction of that ball. Now the second law is force equals mass times acceleration. So what I'm trying to do here is give you an idea of what this means. So the arrow is the force, the body is that first blue square, and I'm actually showing how far it moves as a distance, but I want you to think of that in terms of acceleration. So think when you hit the accelerator pedal on your car, how it goes faster and faster. Well, that's really acceleration, not just this movement that I'm showing here. But anyway, I'm trying to get an idea across. So we're thinking about acceleration. So if I put a force on that, it's going to move a certain amount with a certain acceleration. If I double the force, it's going to double its acceleration. And if I put the same force on it, but I double the mass, it's going to half its acceleration. So that's Newton's second law. The third law is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction or action. So on the left here, we've got two masses that are pretty big. And on the other side, on the right, we've got that little ball. So the arrow in between them shows the little ball, and the bigger mass has the arrow going between it. Now, those two things are exerting an equal force, but that equal force moves the big object with the big mass on the left a little bit, but it moves the small object with the small mass a lot on the right. So I like to compare it to my shotgun. When I shoot my shotgun, my body's heavy and it moves just a little bit. You'll see the shotgun kick my shoulder, but it moves the shot out the end of my barrel very rapidly. So it's got great acceleration, whereas my body doesn't move very much at all. So here's the Big Bang Theory. This is what I thought we were going to start with, but we're actually starting with Newton's laws. So we're starting with nothing or this massive energy in a super small area, which is the next box. And then it explodes, and as that energy expands, it cools and forms matter. So we start with small objects like subatomic particles, then then atoms, which form elements, and then the elements get bigger and bigger until we start beginning to have, eventually we have stars and etc. Planets. Now, what we're saying is, or what John Gribben was saying, is if the universe is determined, then everything would be kind of like a pool table. So if a pool player hits that ball on the left and it goes into this rack of balls, the good pool player knows where the balls are going to go, right? And when the pool player hits the cue ball into a ball, it knows where that ball is going to go. It knows which ball it's going to hit, right? Same thing, if we knew everything down to the atomic level or the subatomic level, if we knew when particles were forming, if we knew their velocity and position, we could predict what they're going to bump into, and we could predict the future. So everything would be determined. There'd be no choices in life. We could predict everything. Now, I want to get into abiogenesis. This is the start of life. It was proposed by Jack Szostak. I think he got a Nobel Prize maybe for this. And what I'm showing here on the far left is a small molecule, and it has formed this kind of a cylinder, and it's got another molecule trapped inside of it. So we've got this molecule forming like a membrane with another molecule trapped inside of it, and then we've got a bigger one right next to it. And those two can come together, and the contents within each of them become the contents within this new bigger thing. And what Dr. Szostak was saying is that's like a cell. That's how cells actually formed. The start of life, abiogenesis, is life starting without life, right? So that was an idea. So if that's the start of life, then where do we go? Well, the next thing is that life evolves. And I've got this link for Berkeley, evolution.berkeley.edu. That's one of the best things I've seen on evolution. So if you want to go there and get more depth in this, but this is where I got this. And the definition of evolution is biological evolution, simply put, is descent with modification. This definition encompasses small-scale evolution, changes in gene frequency in a population from one generation to the next, and large-scale evolution, the descent of different species from a common ancestor over many generations. So atheistic evolution is based on a mechanism of change. In other words, I'm saying atheistic evolution because some will say, well, there's no such thing as atheistic evolution, there's just evolution. God doesn't have anything to do with it. Well, that's really my point, because some might try to say that God has something to do with it, and evolution doesn't have anything to do with God. All right? So I'm just trying to make it clear, atheistic evolution. And there's actually a website on how to teach science that uses this term atheistic evolution as part of the idea of how we have to teach science. Anyway, I want to go through these four mechanisms of change. One is mutation, and that's where DNA fails to copy properly. And we usually think of that as due to external forces. So like we concern ourselves with that in chiropractic. If we x-ray somebody, if we x-ray the genitals, we think we might cause some alteration in the DNA and cause problems with offspring, right? So that's an example. We could have chemical changes, we could have a number of things, but we're thinking about it changing DNA, and it's got to change it in the gonads, right? To change the either ova or sperm to make it pass down to generations. Migration is the movement of a population with the common genes. So if we have, animals can move, plants don't move unless they're blown, like the seeds are blown or something like that. But we're talking about a migration. We're all, I think, familiar with the idea of a migration. Something moves from one area to another, either because it needs better food or better climate or something. It's making some kind of a change. And we usually don't think of that as being something that, like the wind blowing it, right? We often think of that as something that an animal's making a decision based on something, right? Genetic drift is the random killing of a portion of the population with the same gene. So I think Berkeley uses the idea of a green beetle and a brown beetle. So that'd be two different species or two different types of beetles. And if the green ones are on the ground in the grass where they're well protected, if we walk across then kill them because we're stepping on them, that would be a random killing and would change the proportion of green beetles to brown beetles in that area if there was also brown beetles, say in the trees, for example. And then natural selection is this process that happens when certain genes allow for better survival of a population given the climate or wherever the genes find themselves. So if we have a plant or an animal in a certain area, if the genes favor the plant or animal for that particular area, then the plant or animal will survive. If they're not favored for that area, they're more likely to die. And a key to all this is for the genetic code to be passed along, it only has to be good for long enough that reproduction happens. Right? So it doesn't say anything about long-term survival. It just has to be good enough that we get reproduction. So what have we covered? We covered the Big Bang. We said there was particles formed based on Newton's laws and determinism. We could have abiogenesis and evolution. So there's no God involved. But what we find is everything could be predicted. So eventually, if we go through that process, we have this body, we come up with a human being, and we're saying now this human being has a mind. Well, where did the mind come from? Well, the mind doesn't exist, right? The mind's not something in this process. It's just a creation of the brain. So based on remember our philosophy of cause and effect relationships, if the brain causes the mind is the effect. The mind can't then affect the brain, right? The brain's got to change in order for the mind to change. And that's key to this whole idea. So if you can control your mind, and that's what we're trying to do with this very first video, this first exercise, we're trying to control the mind. How do you control the mind? Where did the force come from that causes your brain to change? And I'm going to argue that comes from a dualism, your spirit, your mind, God, whatever it is, somehow you can control your brain. And that's what produces your mind. So you actually control your brain, and that produces your mind. And that's the process we're trying to get in control of. All right, let's hide this and talk here for a little bit. That's partway through. Now, some people think that quantum mechanics gives support to this idea that the mind controls matter. And we're going to talk about that in this next video. Thanks for watching.